All right, Yokoso. This is just a quick little discussion of after final practice. Um, is this recording? It is. Okay, great. Um, I get a lot of questions about how to choose different procedures by which to file after final responses. Sometimes I don't receive questions. People just say, please file a response to a final office action. And I don't know what they want me to do. So we're going to walk through this today. Um, as always, we've got our disclaimer here. Uh, after final practice is very complicated. Um, I'm just giving a brief overview. It's going to be very fact specific. I don't know how to handle, uh, I can't predict what the best option for the case that you're working on right now is. You know, it's very fact specific, and it's difficult. So this is the chart we're mostly going to focus on today. Um, the we're so all right. So let's go down the left uh, column here. So these are the different types of responses that you can file to a final office action. You can file a request for reconsideration. Um, we can file an amendment without an RCE. That's an amendment under 37 CFR 1.116. You can file an amendment with an RCE. That's an amendment under 37 CFR 1.114. You can file a after final consideration pilot AFCP 2.0 program request. You can file a pre-appeal brief request for review, and you can file a formal appeal brief. And there used to be another one called the P3 program. Along the top, we've got, whether that type of response is focused on amendments or arguments, whether a notice of appeal is necessary. This is important because there's a fee associated with a notice of appeal. And the next column is whether a further reply might be necessary. After final practice is very time sensitive. There might be benefits to filing responses within 2 months of the final office action. In some cases, people wait until the 3-month date, and that doesn't the type of response you file doesn't necessarily stop the clock. And so people might have issues with extensions of time or possibly even abandonments. So this is really, it's really difficult. All right, so the first one we're going to discuss is the request for reconsideration. Sometimes people just call this a response. It is only presenting arguments in response to the final office action. You are asserting the patentability of the claims as they stand. No notice of appeal is necessary. These are free to file. And they don't stop the clock. So a further reply might be necessary if the arguments do not place the application in condition for allowance. If that's the case, typically you'll receive an advisory action. Okay. Your next option is an amendment without an RCE. These are premised on amendments. Of course, anything that has amendments can have arguments as well. But obviously, if you didn't have amendments, it'd just be a request for reconsideration. And a request for reconsideration, incidentally, must be considered by the examiner. An amendment without an RCE does not need to be considered. And we'll get to that in a second. So, no notice of appeal is required. This is, again, free to file. and a further reply is going to be necessary if not allowed. You know, maybe the case gets allowed because of your amendments, you're fine. If you get an advisory action, the clock has not stopped, you need to file a subsequent response. And this subsequent response might just be procedural, might be just filing an RCE. It could be filing an additional amendment with an RCE. But my point is just that, if you don't get an allowance, you're going to need to file another response. Okay, this is the one people are most familiar with, probably. It's an amendment with an RCE. Of course, this is focused on amendments. No notice of appeal. The RCE takes the place of the notice of appeal, and a further reply is not necessary. That stops the clock. You don't need to worry about an abandonment then. The AFCP program is focused on amendments. Again, if you only had arguments, you'd be filing a request for reconsideration. There is no notice of appeal, and a further reply, again, is necessary if not allowed. These can result in an allowance, but if not, you'll have either an advisory action or an AFCP interview. And again, your clock doesn't stop running. You'll need to file an RCE or a notice of appeal or something. And the notice of appeal doesn't stop your clock either. Certain additional actions are necessary to stop your clock. So that's why I'm saying, like, this is very, very fact specific. It does, this brief seminar does require some previous familiarity with this stuff. And we're going to talk about a little bit more about these different options in a moment. Right now, we're just kind of putting up all the information at once. All right. So anyway, the pre-appeal brief request for review focused on arguments. A notice of appeal is necessary in this case. There is that fee. And a further reply is necessary if not successful. So there's actually two different outcomes. Well, there's 4 different outcomes for the pre-appeal brief program. But 2 of them would be considered successful. The first one is, of course, an allowance, which are quite rare. But it's also possible that that the examiner reopens prosecution, and that's probably more frequent than an allowance. And I would say is the typical preferred outcome. When we file pre-appeal briefs, this is the outcome we're looking for, is that the examiner reopens prosecution. And so if the examiner reopens, there's no need to file a further reply, right? The examiner will send you a new office action. And so that's why this is written as yes, if not successful. Success would be an allowance or reopening prosecution. All right, and then your last option, of course, is a formal appeal brief. These are focused on arguments. It is possible to amend, of course, very, very small amendments. In the request for reconsideration and the pre-appeal brief request, there are no amendments. So you can amend a little bit in an appeal brief. If I've done it ever, I've done it once. They're quite rare. Of course, a notice of appeal is necessary. And a further reply, it does stop the clock in terms of your final office action. The notice of appeal, when you file the appeal brief, the examiner will have to file an examiner's answer or reopen prosecution or allow the case. And so there'll be a new timeline based on the examiner's answer in that situation or on the new office action. But there's no further response to the final office action that's necessary. All right, and so these programs are limited in different ways, and that's really what we're choosing. That's why also we started with that first slide, is because a lot of people already know this stuff. So for the limitations on the request for reconsideration, there are none. You're only arguing. You can argue whatever you want for as long as you want. You can file as many of these as you want. A lot of people might be familiar with our Examiner series. Please do not file as many as you want. File one. You can file one after final response. You will definitely make your examiner upset if you file multiple after final requests. But this stuff is difficult. It's very fact specific, and sometimes you might want to file a second one for very fact specific reasons. Usually you wouldn't file a second request for reconsideration. Even in that case, it would be more like an amendment or something. But yeah, you can file multiple after final requests. Don't do it though, unless you talk to someone that really knows what they're doing. The amendment without an RCE, the limitations, officially there are no limitations. You can amend as much as you want. It's just not going to get entered. So officially, you can do whatever you want. Your examiner is allowed to consider that. However, they are not likely to do so. So in practice, really what gets entered by an amendment without an RCE is rewriting your claims, rewriting allowable claims in independent form. You can cancel claims. Some examiners will allow you to change the dependency chain. For example, if you've got claim one, what would it look like? You would, if you had independent claim one, and then I guess you'd have to have a second dependent claim. So like 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't know. It would be complex. You can change your dependencies a little, but not all examiners will allow it. Sometimes you'll even have to call the examiner if you're doing more than just rolling up a dependent claim. There become concerns about, and you can also check like antecedent basis, right? If you roll up, if it's claim 1, 2, and 3, and you roll up 2, and now there's a word in claim 3 that has to change from a to the, that's likely to get entered. You can cancel non-allowable claims, but really, an amendment after final has to put the application in condition for allowance with a bare minimum of effort on the examiner's part, if you intend to get that entered and considered by the examiner. Other things can happen, but by and large, it's very, very, very strict. You are very unlikely to get these entered ever. An amendment with an RCE, there are no limitations. You can do whatever you want. You can add claims. You can, do whatever you want. You filed an RCE. And that's really what's going on in the previous one, right? If there's no RCE, the examiner often wants an RCE. Again, that's a topic we've discussed during examine IRCs. And so therefore, an examiner is unlikely to enter an amendment without an RCE if he can require you to file an RCE, reasonably require. The AFCP program has this really strange phrase. The limitation is that there must be an amendment to at least one independent claim that does not broaden the scope in any aspect. I don't know anyone that will tell you for sure that they know what that means. Practitioners disagree, examiners disagree. I don't think the USPTO has clarified it. The issue is, what if another independent claim does broaden, or only one claim is amended? It's and there's a lot of considerations that go into that. What happens if you construe it one way? You say, oh, it's fine, it's okay to broaden the other ones because I've got my at least one independent claim. I did amend one independent claim that doesn't broaden it. The other ones are broadened. You know, you might have that questioned if you go to enforce the patent. I try to be very conservative on that. I don't broaden any of my independent claims if I can help it, or if I need to. Maybe I'll ask the examiner in an interview beforehand. Like I had one where I very much disagreed with the examiner on like a 112 issue, and the cleanest way to handle it was to just delete the feature out from the claim, which would broaden it. And so I asked the examiner, I'm like, look, I want to file this under the AFCP, but this could broaden one of my independent claims. And he said it was okay in that case. That doesn't mean it's okay in your case. That doesn't mean I'm going to do it again. Again, this stuff is really fact specific. But again, some examiners will interpret it one way, some will interpret it another way. Different attorneys will interpret it differently. That's the phrase, proceed with caution. The pre-appeal brief request for review is limited to 5 pages. It's kind of an odd thing. I've definitely seen attorneys try to do it single-spaced to try and cram as much information in there as possible. Some attorneys do, you've got the captions, the signature block, maybe you want stuff, and if you go from, maybe you usually write double spaced, and for these you're going to do 1.5 spaced. The 5 pages is difficult, but you're supposed to make reference to the record. For example, if something's been argued previously, so you don't really need to set forth a lot of arguments in these things, ideally. The pre-appeal brief request for review is not intended for every appealable matter. So although the rules state, for example, that if the examiner provides no motivation, that's a suitable grounds for a pre-appeal brief request. However, generally speaking, obviousness is not a proper grounds for filing a pre-appeal brief request for review. Have I done it? Yes. Have I been successful doing it? Yes. Again, it's very fact specific. I do what the client tells me in most cases. But I typically would not file a pre-appeal brief request on an obviousness rejection. It's not meant for that. It's just, the outcome of these pre-appeal brief requests is a checkbox, and you're very likely to just get the checkbox that says, yep, proceed to appeal, and you've just wasted time and money. So, I mean, you can do it, but it's a waste of money. Pre-appeal brief requests, by the way, are for other things. Again, we've discussed this in exam and IRCs. It's for inherency. It's for things like, the dates on a reference. Clear issues of fact is, I believe, the phrase, or something like that. You cannot discuss petitionable matters in a pre-appeal brief request for review. So you can't do drawings, objections, stuff like that. And then we come to the appeal brief. Again, same limitation. No petitionable matters. You can't have pending drawings, objections. A lot of practitioners get slipped up on that. it, you forget, especially because of the dates um, on something. You might you might have a final office action, and you're filing your notice of appeal, and then all of a sudden you're like in your appeal brief, and you're like, oh my gosh, my drawings were due, a while ago, and they're petitionable, and I can't appeal those, and it's pretty tough. So we definitely want to wrap up our drawings objections and the like before we proceed with an appeal. That's basically it. I mean, this stuff is really complex. It's very fact specific. If you have any questions, you can reach out to us. This is our general patents email address at Moodle. Yeah, I'm sure you have questions. Generally we've been doing a lot of this kind of content on the blog, but this seemed a little bit better for an informal discussion, based on these slides. Let's go back to the slides again. I just kind of want to, here, in case anyone wants to take one last look at them. Great. Thanks a lot for your time, everybody. Have a good one.